So hi, everyone. Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, or at least the virtual version of ourselves. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our event, Fermenting and Foraging, Resourcefulness in the Historical and Contemporary Kitchen. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with YIVO, YIVO is a special place for the contemplation and celebration of Jewish history and culture. And at the core of YIVO, we have our archives and our library, which have some 23 million items and 400,000 books. And so all throughout the year, we do events like this one, and we have exhibits and classes to really showcase the kind of collections that we have here. So today's program is actually an outgrowth of one of our classes, which perhaps some of you may have already taken. It's called A Seat at the Table, A Journey into Jewish Food. And it's a class that goes into the history and even some recipes of Ashkenazi cuisine. The class itself is self-paced. It's actually still available for anyone to begin now, and it's currently free. So if you haven't yet taken the class, you're welcome to go to the YIVO website and sign up. And one of our wonderful instructors in the course is Jane Ziegelman, who is here with us today to delve further into the topic of resourcefulness. Jane is the other Jane, not me, is the author of the James Beard Award-winning A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression, and is also an author of the bestselling 97 Orchard, An Edible History of 5 Immigrant Families in One New York Tenement. So we're delighted to have her here leading the discussion today. I'll note that throughout the program, we would love to have all of your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom. So we'll try to get to them at the end of the chat. And also to let you know that this event is also going to be on YouTube, so you're welcome to watch it later, encourage your friends to watch it, and check out all of YIVO's events on our YouTube channel. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jane and our panelists for our event.
Thank you, other Jane. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. Resourcefulness has long been a kind of favorite topic of mine for a variety of reasons. One is that we often celebrate the sort of intuitive side of cooking, the love, the intuition. Resourcefulness kind of takes us to the other side of the brain, the thinking side. You need smarts to cook, and our Ashkenazi ancestors had plenty of kitchen smarts. Right next to kashrut, the need for resourcefulness has been one of the great influences on the evolution of Jewish cooking. And in this case, Jewish cooking means Ashkenazi cooking. We're using it in this context as the cuisines of Eastern and Central Europe. In America, as Jews gained economic security and then prosperity, Jewish homemakers began to stray from the kind of budget-conscious preparations that were so important to their European ancestors. But given the current state of events, I think this is an excellent time to reconnect with that history. And helping us do that are two very talented and also very articulate chefs, Jerry Umansky and Ari Miller. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about them. Ari Miller is the chef and proprietor of Musi in Philadelphia, which opened in February 2019. Shortly after opening, Ari was named Best Chef by Philadelphia Magazine, and Eater named Musi one of the 16 best new restaurants in the city. Since July 2020, following a complete shutdown in the wake of COVID-19, Musi is offering the Frizwit. Am I saying that right, Ari? The Frizwit?
Yeah, Frizwit.
Frizwit, which is nothing less than Philly's best cheesesteak. And it's sourced based on the relationship approach. And Ari, I hope that you will have a chance to elaborate on what that is. Jeremy is the chef and proprietor of the Larder Delicatessen and Bakery in Cleveland, Ohio, which was nominated by the James Beard Foundation for Best New Restaurant in America in 2019, excuse me. In 2020, the James Beard people nominated Jeremy for Best Chef in the Great Lakes region. So Jeremy has received quite a bit of national recognition. That's wonderful. Jeremy has been featured in numerous publications, including Bon Appetit, the New York Times, and Savoir, and was named the Deli Prophet by Food and Wine. His new book, Koji Alchemy, Rediscovering the Magic of Mold-Based Fermentation, came out earlier this year in May of 2020. Now, we're going to bring in Ari and Jeremy, but one of my jobs here is to provide some historical context to the conversation, and that's sort of that's where we're going to start. If we look back, the Jewish homemakers who emigrated to the US at the start of the 20th century arrived with a full toolkit of strategies for making the most of precious food resources. I'm going to be looking at 3 of them. And as you'll see, they're all kind of interrelated. Now, we tend to think of Jewish cooking, of Ashkenazi cooking, as a meat-heavy cuisine. But in fact, that emphasis on meat is a relatively recent development. The pillars of the traditional Jewish kitchen were in fact plant-based foods. There were potatoes and bread, and the bread was made from the heavy dark grains like rye, millet, barley. There was also kasha and beans. So these were all plant-based, cheap, and filling materials, ingredients. When meat was consumed, and this includes both chicken and fish, they were reserved for the Sabbath or the holiday table. The one exception to that was herring, which of course is a preserved food. And herring, you should know, was eaten 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. When women did cook with meat, it was often with the most inexpensive parts of the animal. So it was the toughest and the fattiest cuts, the flanken, for example, which requires long cooking, or with organ meats, the brain, the spleen, the sweetbreads, and of course, liver. Bones were enormously valuable to Jewish homemakers as a base for soups. And even fish bones were used, for example, in gefilte fish, which is traditionally simmered on a bed of fish bones to give it that wonderful gelatinous sauce that we eat alongside with our gefilte fish. Jewish homemakers cooked with all the extremities, the wings, the feet, the necks, parts of the animal other people might throw away. Now, if one of those homemakers saw us with our supermarket chicken, unwrapping our chicken and reaching into the bird for that packet of giblets and saw us throw that packet away, I'm sure she would shriek. One of my hopes for today is that Jeremy and Ari will tell us what to do with those packets. So please keep that in your minds, guys. Now, in a diet based around starches, an important source of both flavor and nutrition were fermented foods. Pickled cucumbers, sauerkraut, a whole range of pickled vegetables, actually. One of them being Russell, which was pickled beet juice, an important flavoring in borscht. And I'd like to note here that fermented foods played this very interesting kind of double role. On one hand, fermentation was a very important source of preservation. It served a vital, practical function. It was also a way, however, of bringing intensity and excitement to the table. So resourcefulness was more than economic. It also contributed to our enjoyment of eating. And I think that dialectic is something we can maybe play on today. Now, I know that foraging is a promised part of the conversation, and we will be talking about foraging. There was not a lot of foraging in the tenements of the Lower East Side or in the other, great Jewish urban centers, but there was foraging in the old country. And as we get to that conversation, I'm going to tell you more about that. So we're going to sort of hold off on foraging for a minute. And it's time now to turn to our chefs, Jeremy and Ari. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about your early culinary influences as a way to kind of introduce yourselves to all of the invisible people that are with us today. And Ari, let's start with you.
Sure. Hey, thanks. Jane, this is super exciting to be chatting with you in this way. Yeah, you know, I think the early indoctrination to food for me was easily the holiday tables, the grandparents like Mom and Zeta, who, you know, on Sundays would like literally my Zeta would bike up the block to Abe's and Sons and grab bagels and you know, appetizing stuff and that was that was Sunday. It was, you know, it was so wonderful. You know, it's this weird thing, I think, between, you know, coming around the table, being with your family and the food itself. And when they mash up well, I mean, you know, great family can compensate for mediocre food, I suppose, and food can compensate for mediocre family. But, you know, it was that. And then during the week when we would be in town for, you know, my grandfather and my Zeta and his brothers owned some properties, and my dad was like the handyman or the contractor who would, like, you know, fix it. They would bring us deli sandwiches. My early favorites were tongue and hard salami. Those were, you know, just as a kid, you know, I got fed herring, caviar, hard salami, and beef tongue, and you know, the weirdness stuck, I think, and
yeah, right.
You know, to my own delight. Yeah, and that's how, you know, I love things now. The weird bits, the you know, the unpopular kid foods of heart and brain.
There's nothing like a giblet, you know?
There's nothing like a giblet.
Yeah.
The little you know, in Passover, you know, picking the chicken necks off of all the Seder plates, you know, that were on the long table. I would eat them all. The puppets, the stomach muscle. This was one of my favorite things as a kid. And, you know, looking back, it's, you know, that's, I have too many friends who, you know, go ooh at that. And it's, I feel blessed.
Ari, we're going to have problems if we ever find ourselves at the same table, because we're going to be diving for those same parts.
I like my own people.
Hi. Jeremy, can you tell us about some of your early food influences?
Yeah, you know, it's fantastic, Ari, hearing you talk about eating tongue as a kid. And my father always tells this story with his father. My grandfather would get the biggest kick in the world because even as a little baby, we'd go to his house and he'd give me slices of ham and yellow mustard, or I'm sorry, not ham, slices of tongue and yellow mustard. And even as an infant, it was like one of my favorite things. Yeah, you know, those odd bits and being introduced to them. My father's family for Thanksgiving, everybody loves the tush of the turkey, the tail. So as the years went on, finally got to the point where I would go to the butcher and get a 10-pound bag of turkey tails and not even worry about the whole bird. This way everybody was happy. So, you know, I grew up, my grandmother ran the catering out of a synagogue here on Cleveland's east side. Around the time of my bar mitzvah, she started yanking me and bringing me in the kitchen and saying, it's your turn to make the tuna salad, to slice the lox and that sort of thing. And just grew up in a household with a love for food. My mother cooked all the time. My grandmother, of course, cooked all the time, doing all the catering. And I was really fortunate too. My mom knew a few wild plants. So there was a blackberry bramble a couple blocks from our house. She'd take us there as kids and we'd sit there and pick them, eat them. And she knew a couple other things. So The eating of offal, the finding of wild foods, even from when I was younger, these were just normal and naturalized things for me to do. And that tends to be pretty much all I do these days now.
It's interesting to me that as kids, you were both given free reign at the table, and the weird bits were not held back from you. And I see that as a great lesson for us in raising our kids, is to let them eat the weird stuff, and grow up to be, Jeremy's and Ari's great, chefs with this appreciation for these foods. So just on a parenting note. And of course, those bits are the cheat bits. So it really plays into the resourcefulness story. Were you going to say something, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother's gefilte fish, which we basically use a little bit of an updated version of her recipe at larder. I mean, still to this day, I can never eat enough of it. Even as a little kid, she would send my parents home with a Ziploc bag full of balls of it. And that was, Passover is so special to this day still, because being able to eat gefilte fish every day for a week, just especially hers, very, very litvak, very heavy on the pepper, lots of good sweet carrot in there, no sugar, but not lots of boiled carrot for a little sweetness. And everybody, I can still get tears in my eyes from her grain. It's so potent. But yeah, even as a little kid, that was so delicious.
Well, just on the subject of the weird bits, Jeremy and Ari, what do we do with that packet that's in the chicken? For us home cooks, we only get one bird at a time. What should we do? I don't want to throw that out.
I think one of the things that caused me to fall in love with the kitchen was those are the cook's bits. Uh-huh. You don't have to share those. There aren't that much. Like while you're cooking during the day, while the bird's roasting, I'm not opposed to, you don't have to share everything. Cook them off in a little bit of oil, a little bit of salt, and just enjoy yourself.
Excellent. I mean, that is actually what I do with the liver. I just fry it up quietly on the stove, and that's my little treat. So you've given me permission to continue. Thank you for that.
You're cooking family dinner. Like you should, you should.
Yeah, payback.
That's right.
You save them too, Jane. First off, everybody out there should be buying whole chicken. There's no reason to spend $2 or $3 extra per pound to buy boneless, skinless chicken breasts. Buy whole chicken. It's very simple to cut it into the different pieces that you may need for any given application. You don't even need a knife. I use a scissors here at home. So it's a super, super simple, easy thing to do. And when you do it with scissors, even your kids can help you because there isn't so much sharp there as with a knife. But, when you get just a heart and a gizzard and a liver, save them. A lot of times I'll put them in like a quart container and keep them in the freezer. And I keep adding to it every time I get a chicken. And then when it's time to make some chopped liver or, I just like to saute the gizzards and the hearts together. On another level too, if you're a meatloaf household or a meatball household, add it to your mix. It's great. It's super flavorful, and if anybody's weirded out by it, they're not going to pick it out of the meatloaf.
Right. So it's a great way to hide your weird bits to your more squeamish dinner guests.
Yeah. And
you can tell them afterwards.
I mean, listen, when it comes down to it, here's the black and white reality. When we really think that we raise an animal, another sentient being, solely to kill it and to feast on its flesh, when we talk about it in those words and those contexts, all of its weird bits. It doesn't matter if it's a steak muscle group or the brains. It's that whole act is pretty intense. Yeah. So, as far as value goes, in my eyes, there's no difference between a good ribeye steak and some grilled liver. It's it's all the same.
I think that's something I've found myself saying frequently as well, that if you think that, this part of the animal is ew and gross, and this part of the animal is delicious and delectable, that you should probably consider vegetarianism or veganism, because you really are not engaging in the way. I mean, you might not like liver, that's legitimate, but to dismiss it as gross is to me, it's difficult to match up that thought process with, but the muscle ripped off of the leg is completely palatable.
Yeah. And that's a great part of conversation. I've had many conversations with people too. Heart is, especially beef heart, is one of my favorite go-tos. And when you talk about beefy flavor, there is no beefier cut of meat on that animal than the heart. It is just so flavorful, and it's easy to cook because you have to cook it so fast. But when I have this conversation with people, it's, I'm not eating that. The steak's okay, but the heart's not.
Well, of course, these are cultural precepts. And if we think about them and are more conscious about them, maybe we can sort of reform our ideas about which parts are okay and which parts aren't okay. So for people that are squeamish, maybe it is a good time to just question how we formed those categories. And to people who have already sort of experienced the pleasure of them, come over. We welcome you to the giblet side. It's wonderful there. Leaving giblets and the other bits for a moment, we promised a conversation on fermentation, and you both are very advanced fermenters. It's a huge topic, obviously. And I guess I would just like to start by asking, what is it about fermentation that has captured the imagination of so many younger chefs and do-it-yourselfers? And Jeremy, maybe we'll put this one to you first.
So I'm going to give you a two-part answer.
Yeah.
I think there's a direct answer to your question. And then I tend to be a little bit more esoteric, I guess we could say.
Sure.
With it. So I'm going to give you both. So fermentation equals flavor, and it also equals you can do whatever you want. You can create whatever you want. And that is really, really attractive to a lot of young cooks and to home cooks, to be able to take something and do it in a Vietnamese style, or do it in a Litvak style, or something from South America, to start with the same core ingredient, but to be able to put these individual identities on something and have this wonderful fermented product, I think is very empowering to a lot of people. On top of that, rightly so, fermentation is fortunately trendy again. It used to be out of necessity that we all had to. We didn't have, consistent refrigeration and those sorts of things. So fermented foods were a huge part of our diet. Physiologically, we've evolved in a way where we need fermented foods in our diet to maintain homeostasis within our bodies and to have proper health. And then for me, I have this conversation with people often, and this is what I tell them. In an 8-ounce jar of sauerkraut, we have about 10 trillion organisms in there. These beneficial organisms that create the sauerkraut. And if we extrapolate that out over a gallon, 128 ounces, we end up with a number that rivals the amount of observed bodies in the universe through any telescope that NASA has access to. So if you hold a gallon jar of sauerkraut, you can literally hold a whole cosmos in your hand, because every force of physics is happening in that jar. the weak electronic force, gravity, creation, destruction, it's all happening there all the time on a scale that's too small for us to really physically comprehend, just as it's happening out there on a scale that's too large for us to fully comprehend. So that universality of it, that I can be part of the greater cosmos and still hold and create another one within my hands, is immensely fascinating to me. And that's what draws me in.
Wow.
It's also very delicious.
And it just tastes freaking good. Yeah.
That's right.
When I promised articulate to our audience, I didn't know we'd be talking about the cosmos in a jar of sauerkraut, but I'll never forget that. Maybe can you tell us, Jeremy, a little bit about the fermenting that you do in your restaurant?
Yeah, we do a lot, and COVID has definitely changed things up for us in terms of what we have available on our menu, but it hasn't really slowed us down for the amount that we produce. So at any given time, we used to have about a dozen different types of fermented vegetables offered in our deli case, all different types of pickles. We are highly seasonal with a lot of things. So our kosher dill pickle, while we typically always have one, what it's made from changes seasonally. So we only make it with cucumbers during cucumber season. And then we go into green tomatoes. And then the rest of the year, we do carrots. So we always have this constantly evolving set of what it is to be a kosher dill pickle. Carrots are by far the biggest seller too when we do them. So even when we have the kosher dill cucumbers in there, people are like, where are the carrots? That's what we want. Aside from that, we do a lot of different fermentation techniques with different cuts of meat. We make pastrami, we make that in-house. That goes through a fairly subdued fermentation process, but one nonetheless. We bake fresh breads every day. And we're always creating various foods using fermentation.
So I notice you're putting bread baking in the fermentation category. Can you explain?
100%. I mean, outside of making a quick bread that relies on, chemical leaveners like baking soda or baking powder, bread baking itself relies on yeast, which is a organism responsible for a fermentation reaction. So it eats sugars that are found in the bread. And then as a byproduct, it produces carbon dioxide and alcohol, but that's what causes your bread to rise. These microscopic shots of CO2 that the yeast is putting out. So bread is, and some of our breads, there's quick breads where you just let the yeast do its thing for a couple hours. Our rye bread is a long ferment. So the dough goes a minimum of 12 hours, allowing the yeast to do its work. We also work with some different other types of mold and fungi, this koji mold that we work with. So it takes root there. And anybody that's baked bread, whether it's challah or rye bread, you're relying on fermentation to help you out there. Interestingly enough, if we go back, instant yeasts weren't widely available till World War II. So anybody baking bread at home prior to that was either using a starter, like this mother culture, of wild and live yeast found in their home that they would keep alive in a flour slurry. Or, you may have had the money or been fortunate to get a live yeast cake, but very few people could actually afford those. So just going back not too far, we have a whole generation of people, many generations of people who all bread baking relied on wild types of fermentation.
And of course, you can capture yeast out of the air. You can attract them to maybe a pot of potato water.
Yeah, I want everybody to take one deep breath really quick with me. Congratulations, you literally just inhaled millions of yeast spores and fungal spores and bacteria that are in the air, most of them beneficial. So They are there. You don't really have to do much of anything to introduce them when you're making sauerkraut or pickles or bread. What you have to do is you have to actually act as a shepherd or a farmer per se. You have to cultivate an environment that is conducive to them. So much like the shepherd keeps the wolf out of the flock and keeps them moving to fresh pasture, you have to do the same. You've got to know the ins and outs to keep the pathogens away, the bad stuff. But then your job is to create this hospital environment so that they can thrive, and then you can make delicious food.
Ari, can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with fermentation?
Yeah, it's actually, I was just reminded by a Facebook memory that this is actually the anniversary of the first time I made sauerkraut for an event, some years back. And, I think that, the deliciousness of sauerkraut, that it appears in more or less this similar form in so many different cuisines is like, it's so special because it's almost like your traveling buddy. You like go from, Irish to Jewish to Polish and like you've got your same friend sauerkraut alongside the whole time. It's also cabbage and salt. And there's something so mystical. I think like this sort of on the same notion, like let's call it this God complex that Jeremy's describing of creating this cosmos, like, Lisa's, tooth in the Petri dish where she creates a new world. And it's so special. I mean, because there's also something about, the sort of the dry brining also where the salt draws out the liquid from the cabbage and it provides its own matrix for this to happen. It's just, there's something so, I think, special and just mystifying about this process that happens, that now this vegetable is going to defy its lifespan and live for forever, quote unquote. You're going to eat it at some point, and that's just, I think, really neat. And to Jeremy's point about the kosher dill pickle, going from cucumber to green tomato to carrot it's such a cornerstone of being able to be part of, and this is where the notion of relationship cuisine that we use to describe this idea of being outside of an industrial foodways system, that we can't just get a cucumber all year round. It's not really the point. I don't want, you hear every, waxing philosophic on the tomato is cliche at this point, but it's very true. That tomato, the first time of the year when you finally bite into that real tomato and that the pleasure and the joy of you've survived a cycle, you've moved through seasons to get to this next point. I mean, that's, I think, back to the holiday table idea of this is life cycle, this is harvest. And it's interesting to do it in an urban environment. I think that's where we've, as this generation of chefs have adopted this idea of cooking seasonally and working with foragers or foraging yourself. One of the most exciting things for me is that the notion of micro seasons, which I wasn't really familiar with until I got into the professional kitchen, that you can have a season that's a week long. And so the specialness of the tomato, which is around for a few months, like you can have like a particular flower that just is everything. And it's gone in a blink of an eye, but for that brief moment, you connect with where you were the year prior. And fermentation is sort of, for me, that same notion of time travel. When you dig into your kraut 6 months later and you remember where you were and how that cabbage felt in your hands and what it was like at the peak of its season, and then how it is now that you've sort of shepherded its deterioration or its regeneration, is just special. I mean, it's right before the shutdown in March, we had a dish that had a lot of like mustard greens and things like that. And we just simply fermented everything. And we have this vat of kraut right now that, you know, wouldn't exist if we hadn't had to deal with the fact that we had these cases of greens that we had to save.
What should we be fermenting right now, given where we are in the year? What foods do you recommend we ferment?
Everything.
I mean, what are some that we might not think were fermentation compatible? Can you ferment a squash, for instance?
Yeah. Broccoli and potatoes for me are heaven. You still have to cook a fermented potato. There are some toxin issues, but you get, I mean, you know, the combination of potatoes and vinegar is like classic, and you get this super tangy potato that's just absolutely gorgeous.
If people wanted to find out more on how to do that, where would we go? Where should we go for instructions?
There's a woman in Philly named Amanda Pfeiffer who published a book called Ferment Your Vegetables. I would recommend that. I imagine if you want to go the koji route, that there's another book that we could recommend.
Yes. Would you like to say some things about koji, Jeremy?
Yeah. First, I do want to say right now, pumpkin everything. I make tons of pumpkin pickles. And it's, you know, kind of parlaying off your question, like, where would I learn how to do this? Ask a grandparent, because there's a chance they may have made these foods at one point in time, and there's some sort of family recipe that for whatever reason fell out of favor. So always go that route first and try to keep alive what traditions may have been forgotten. So that's really important. You know, the second thing to keep in mind is fermentation is so ubiquitous, not just because it was so important for us, but also because it's so easy. Mm-hmm. So once you learn some of the basic tenets, like how much salt do I add to a vegetable to ferment it? And that answer is a minimum of 2% salt by weight. At our restaurant, we do 3% salt by weight because we like the flavor a bit better. So as long as you learn that and you stay clean, you don't cross-contaminate, you wash your hands, you know, don't cut chicken on the cutting board before you shred the cabbage to make kraut, use basic food safety. Pretty much you don't need much more knowledge. That's the proper amount of salt is first and foremost, and then having really good hygiene practice. So this isn't something you should be intimidated by, you know, be fearful of, or that sort of thing. And you should be grateful and thankful that these foods were around for your ancestors to eat so you could be here now. So
I realize, Jeremy, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I realize we're sort of getting close to the time when questions come in, and we haven't said anything about foraging.
Sure.
So do you think we can get some foraging into our conversation? Let's try. You know, I didn't bring in foraging to my intro because it wasn't part really of the Jewish American experience, but it was very much part of the Jewish shtetl experience. Living in the shtetls, Jews were surrounded by fields and forests. And we don't normally think of Jews as being sort of people of nature. But our Jewish ancestors knew the natural world. And one thing they knew how to do was forage. There were a couple of foods that they really went after. One was sorrel, which was a springtime food used to make sjav, one of the great Jewish soups. There was also foraging for berries and foraging for mushrooms, which were often then dried and used through the year. Jeremy, what brought you to foraging? You spoke a little bit about your mom and the blackberries. Tell us a little bit about foraging in your life now.
In my life now, it's something that I do all the time. I've gone to the extent that I'm a licensed wild mushroom expert through the Michigan Department of Agriculture. So I've taken it to a bit of an extreme, one could say. But in researching, when we decided we were going to open up a larder, which by the way is another name for a pantry or a root cellar, no connection with lard. We get a lot of questions about that. We decided we wanted the food to be of an Eastern European Jewish influence, but also speak through the lenses of we're in Cleveland. So we wanted to talk about the Great Lakes through our food. And the people that were here indigenously, while nobody was here permanent, there was a number of tribes that came through. And then the people that came in after them and the people that are here now, we wanted to incorporate all those elements. And one of the very common themes was the foraging of food. This Eastern European history of, yes, going after the mushrooms, the berries, in some cases, different nuts, was so important. And we figured out we couldn't tell any of these stories without including it. So over the years, this is something, and I saw earlier that Irene is here, her late husband, Gary Linkoff. I had the fortunate opportunity to study underneath him in New York City. A great mushroom mind. And, seeing these foods, seeing them be used, it makes you wonder why they aren't more commonplace and why we've kind of forgotten this knowledge. Because not only is it just about great food and embracing nature, but I have a 5-year-old daughter. She comes out with me. She's a lot closer to the ground than I am. So she spots the mushrooms a lot quicker and she has fun doing it. So it's something we can do as a family and we can bond together, and then we can take that food that we found very similar to like you growing something in your garden and taking it and then cooking it. There's a huge amount of intimacy and romance and sensuality associated with that. And to deny any of those things in any of our cuisine or any of our foods would be abhorrent. If we got rid of the sensuality of eating, nobody would find it pleasurable. It would be horrible. It'd be something we just stuff into an orifice just to make sure we didn't die. So being able to embrace it on that level it's just wonderful. It's intimate and it's incredibly romantic.
I'm so impressed by both of you actually for the holistic way that you guys think about food. Bringing in, we're talking about the cosmos and sensuality, and I don't know, it's everywhere. Anyway, it's a great perspective on food that I'm finding very inspiring. I hope other people are as well. And I'm sort of, I guess, trying to wrap up a little bit because I think, and Jane can tell me this, but Jane, is it time to bring questions in?
Yeah, so we've gotten a lot of really great questions from all of you and a really lively chat, which I've personally really been enjoying seeing. So one question maybe you can start out with from Irina. They say, I grew up in Romania eating brains, tongue, chicken gizzards, and heart and liking them a lot. I wasn't aware of this being a Jewish food. I believe Europeans eat these things too. Any thoughts?
They do eat them. Everybody does. What makes it a Jewish food is Jews eating it in a given time and place and the specific things that they do with them that maybe the general population around them who's also eating the same food doesn't exactly do.
Yeah, so, no, go on, Jeremy. I mean, well, actually, no.
They get from them.
Jews eat the foods that other people eat, but they do it Jewish. So it's the treatment, it's the way it's approached, it's the way the food is treated in accordance with the laws of kashrut. It's the larger context. So it's true, these are not exclusively Jewish foods, but they have played a very important role in the traditional diet, and we've lost them in this country. And I'm trying to think of ways to bring them back in. So these are guys that are that are doing it, both Jeremy and Ari. But I think that's a good question. It's true. These are not, foraging, of course, is not an exclusively Jewish activity, but there's a Jewish way of doing it.
And I'm sure Ari can elaborate a little bit with an Israeli perspective. Like, I look at Israeli food as Israeli food and not necessarily Jewish food, being an American Jew. And I'm sure, Ari, you've got a little bit of a different take on that too.
Yeah, I mean, well, one first thing is, I was going to say, in terms of that Jewish notion versus not Jewish notion of like these offals and things like that, like liver is something that jumps out to me. I think like chopped liver, like that shtetl chopped liver that I grew up on, that I make and that I love, is so Jewish. And I remember being a kid loving chopped liver and hearing about, the horrid liver and onions. I had no idea what liver and onions was. Like, it wasn't a dish that I encountered. And, liver really only existed as chopped liver. And it turns out I like liver and onions also. But, there was like this, Jewish and this, Goyish version of things, as my mom.
Which is really quite funny because it's the same ingredients.
It's the same things.
Right. It's exactly the same. It's liver and onions.
I encountered corned beef outside of the deli, and my mom was like, well, it's not Jewish corned beef. This is Goyish corned beef. And I was like, I love corned beef. Like, how is this going to be a problem? Like, I love the institution of corned beef. And I did. I love this Goyish Irish corned beef. That was, wonderful. But I mean, as far as the Israeli stuff goes, I lived in Israel for 12 years and I'd written about food and then got into the kitchen in Tel Aviv. I have a bit of a, I think, sort of problem with some of this global term of Israeli cuisine and what that has come to mean. But it's within Israeli cuisine, there's this, very strong Eastern European. I mean, the chefs that I worked for and with in Tel Aviv, we, stuffed spleen was something that was like a yearly thing that we would make, spleen stuffed with a cow spleen that would be like, very carefully fillet open and then stuffed with every organ of the lamb and then stitch it back together. But it was always seasoned with like preserved lemons and herbs. So it was sort of not quite Ashkenazi and not quite Mizrahi as well. And it was somewhere in between. But at that same place, the first dish that I ever actually had to pick up on the line was haggis. And it was made by a local charcuterian, like this guy, Alan Tadmor, who was like the sausage king of Tel Aviv. Another thing that was like hugely wonderful and I miss intensely was lung. Lung is it's a federal crime to sell lung for human consumption in the States. We're, I think, the only country or one of the few countries that actually has this law. And like lung is one of the tastiest, best things in the world. And this was something that we would just, skewer with some fat and grill over charcoal. And that to me is Israeli. That's Israeli cuisine is lung skewers.
Another question, Jane?
Yeah, another question we have from Tina, who asks, I read that when our ancestors immigrated, so of course, it sounds like "our" here is specifically referring to the experience of Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, though I'll just note that, of course, it's all kinds of Jews that have immigrated. They often had a sack of potatoes and herring or kippers because they would keep for days or weeks. Can you discuss the foods our ancestors ate when traveling? So perhaps, Jane, this is a question more for you.
Yeah, no, I do think that I know that Jews did travel with herring. It was one of the great traveling foods because it's preserved. I didn't hear about the potatoes, but I do know that they also traveled with, there's a term for it in Yiddish. It might be something like gefrischte, but bread that had been well toasted so that it wouldn't mold. So you would carry this sort of very heavily toasted bread and herring, and those were two of the staples. That it was like a Jewish hardtack. It was one of the staples that our immigrant ancestors used on those long ocean voyages.
Another question we have, which is maybe a little more practical, I'll combine two questions. One is just asking about what kind of equipment one might need in order to start fermenting. And then also when pickling, if it's better to splurge on high quality vegetables or high quality salt/vinegar. So maybe.
I think one of the things, and Jeremy, sort of mentioned this as well with fermenting, is there's a lot of intimidation around it, I think, because there's this, again, it's this mystical procedure. And I think like, it's always, how do you approach something how do you approach mysticism? It's like this otherworldly thing, and you're supposed to just be casual about it. But wash your hands, wash your container, use a clean cutting board, and you're going to be fine. You want to, you don't want to wash your vegetables too much. You want to use that natural bacteria that is coming from what should be the farm. There is, I think this is a good sort of point to mention, there's a difference between an industrial vegetable and a non-industrial vegetable.
Should we use farmers market vegetables for our fermenting?
Ideally for everything.
For everything, but maybe even more for fermenting?
I think more so, yeah. I mean, that's not to say you can't use, supermarket cabbage or supermarket broccoli, but the idea of these bacteria that don't actually exist in the vegetable themselves, but on the vegetable, that comes from the soil and the earth, and how that works.
Yeah, I think quality wise too, use the highest quality of anything for anything. That's what it should be at all times. And once you say to yourself, I'm only going to use things of a specific quality, then the conversation about economics and stuff goes out the window. You also notice too, generally speaking, food that is fresher and of a higher quality is more dense with bioavailable nutrients, meaning it's full of better stuff for your body. And in turn, you are going to eat less of it because your body isn't going to crave for the nutrients that it's missing. So that's one thing. And we've talked a lot about eating seasonally and enjoying these things this once a year, kind of time. Eating that way is really important from a physiological and even a health standpoint as far as nutrition is concerned. So as far as salt goes, there's a lot of discussion. At the restaurant, we use a fine grain salt that comes from Morton. It's akin to table salt, but it doesn't have any anti-caking agents like cornstarch or anything, and it doesn't have iodine in it. We use that because it dissolves really easily in a brine. Then we don't have to cook a brine and boil it, and that whole step gets removed. So it's also, dissolves really nicely on like crushing the cabbage. Now, if you're someone that is having issues with your pickles not being crisp, whether they're your cucumber pickles or they're sauerkraut or any type of pickled food, try to use some sort of sea salt. It is very expensive compared to like the salt I use at Larder. I pay $10 for 50 pounds of salt. But sea salts have trace minerals in them. These minerals they call them electrolytes. And we're familiar with like drinking Gatorade and Powerade and electrolytes. Well, these minerals in the vegetables, what they do is they keep water inside the vegetable cell, which keeps the cell from collapsing. And if the cell stays rigid, that's where you get the crunch when you bite a carrot or bite into a vegetable. So using these high mineral sea salts will help retain moisture and cell structure. So it'll give you crispy, crunchy pickles. That's the only circumstance I say to use a specialized salt in. But otherwise, get the best quality and freshest vegetables you can to ferment. The same ones that you would use for a salad or for a saute or whatever it is are what you want to use to ferment.
So maybe kind of to wrap up, we got one question from Zoe towards the beginning asking if you all had any cookbooks to recommend, and I'll say perhaps also other kinds of books as well, history books. So you are also, of course, all encouraged to register for YIVO's online class, A Seat at the Table, A Journey into Jewish Food, which includes some of the more historical perspective as well as recipes and a discussion board where you can chat with other folks who are taking the course. We have now something over 11,000 people who have registered for the class. So you have a lot of people out there to help kind of navigate all these wonderful questions that have been coming up so far. But for the three of you, any books that you have, or I guess even podcasts or recipe books or places where folks can go to learn more information about these topics?
I'll chime in with, I frequently find myself turning to the Gefilte Manifesto.
Yay, great book.
Liz's book. I mean, they're friends also, so I like love the fact that I love these people, but their book is phenomenal. And I frequently find myself listening to Gastropod. That is Cynthia Graber and Nicola Twilley's sort of view of food through the lens of history and science. And it's great.
Listen to the Koji episode.
I have. Listen to the episode on cocktails where I talk about a terrible attempt I made at Bloody Mary jelly shots.
All right, I'm gonna have to revisit that one.
Great episodes.
Well, I could say a favorite history book of mine is written by a French chef who toured Poland, pre-World War II Poland, looking at the Jewish food traditions of local Polish Jews. And he sort of got the last look before it all went down. His name is Edward Dupamian, and the book is simply called The Jews of Poland. And it's a wonderful, in some ways, tremendously sad book because we know what's coming, but he's right there seeing it as it happens. And a really interesting book, and it's available out there.
Jane, 97 Orchard, I read that in culinary school.
I
will honestly say, if anybody hasn't read it, it's one of those books that as I was forming my identity as a chef, that really got me to think critically about the food I wanted to do. And for me, it was really important to honor like my family's traditions and like this Jewish influence, culinary influence on me. So I gotta say, that's a huge one. And that's why today's been such a joy.
Oh my God, I'm blushing.
There's also Gil Marx's Encyclopedia of Jewish Food.
Yeah.
Is great because you don't have to read the whole, it's literally an encyclopedia, A to Z of Jewish food. And you don't have to read the whole thing at once. You don't have to read it cover to cover. Let's say you're making matzo balls and you're like, oh, the recipe calls for schmaltz. Go ahead to his book and look up the entry on schmaltz and just get a little bit of info and kind of fill in some of the gray areas. So, and there's also, if I may shamelessly.
Yes, do it.
Here's my book, Koji Alchemy. So, and there are
enough time to talk about it,
which is okay, but there are definitely like our Jewish rye bread recipe that we make at Larder and how we make our pastrami and that sort of thing is definitely talked about in there. So
great. Well,
how's that thing? Good. Did we give you good stuff?
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And you are also welcome to revisit this conversation afterwards on our YouTube channel and also check out other events. We have another event that's food related coming up in December. We'll be talking about the origins of the love amongst many Ashkenazi Jews of American Chinese food. So you're welcome to, you also have to bring your own food to that. I apologize, we can't provide you with yours, but you're welcome to bring your own takeout and join us for that event in December. So thank you so much to Ari and to Jeremy and to Jane for joining us today, this afternoon, and really spreading a lot of knowledge, I think. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jane.
Awesome. Thank you.